Welcome, everyone, and welcome to another week where we're doing Celebrating CX today with Jonathan Roper from Briar Bird & Co. He's going to talk more about research and recruiting and the diversity. Really excited to hear what it is that you're going to talk about with us today. My name is Barbara van der Linden. I'm part of Made For, and we will be hosting this session. So take a seat. What we're going to ask you for this session is to keep yourself muted for the duration. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Zoom chat, and we will dedicate some time definitely at the end of today to go through them and answer anything that stood out for you or any questions that you had based on what Jonathan's going to tell us. So Jonathan, welcome, and whenever you're ready, take it away.
Thanks, Barbara. Hi to everyone from Belfast. I've been living in Belfast since May 2021. And previous to that, living in Melbourne, in Australia. So just a bit about me. I've led UX and usability projects for about 20 years. And before that, my first internet job was when the web browser we were using was Mosaic 0.9, which later turned into Netscape. So I've had a great, privilege to sort of be around the traps for a while. My bent is not focused towards technology, but really around customers, content, and services. So typically in projects, my role varies between UX strategist, UX lead, user researcher, content strategist, information architect, that sort of stuff. Because for me, the distinctions are very blurry, because the aim is you do enough user research so you can understand the problem, and you do enough research to inform the design and test the design. So in my teams, while we each have areas of specialty, we all get involved and, we all collaborate extensively. And that's really, because the great thing is when you're on a project is thinking about the problem, but then talking to the people who the problem's going to impact, and that's that's sort of the exciting part. And so the aim in all my research is really to try and bring the voice of the customer into the organisation, and this is where sort of recruiting sort of comes into it. Occasionally we get customers or clients who say that they can do recruiting. They'll do recruiting for the project. And it almost always turns into failure. Because while our clients are dealing with a whole range of customers, they have little, in one sense, first-hand contact with customers. So you might be working for a client and you're talking to the comms or web team, and the people who had the contact with the customers are sitting out in counters or on phones. And there's a surprising amount of gap between the team you're working for and their customers. And that's where we come in. We solve this problem for them through recruiting. So typically in research, I'm looking not for big numbers of participants, but just for good diversity of people and people who are likely to care about the subject matter. I'm going to talk around two or three different projects that I've done, depending on the time available, and just talk about the recruiting process I did, and what happened or what went wrong. I think one of the things to think around, which is always a challenge in all recruiting, is getting the segmentation of your audience right. Sometimes clients really come up with really extensive and detailed segmentation. They want all aspects covered, which you can sort of understand. But then on the other hand, we're dealing with small numbers in qualitative research, really. So it's hard to cover off all those segments. And also it makes sort of recruitment a nightmare. And so sort of a key to it, which we always try and work through, is what are the gateway criteria in segmentation that really can lead to good diversity in terms of our participants. So we get a diverse group of participants who sort of all care about the matter. And so that's sort of just part of that art of recruitment. An example of this, just from a personal note, is Once when I was online dating, and before I met my wife, uh, my key criteria, and I'm from Melbourne, so Melbourne has, um, sort of vibrant music scene, and it has two independent radio stations, um, and it has a lot of other radio stations, but these two independent radio stations, feature prominently in my life. And for me, they're a gateway criteria in meeting people. Because if I could find someone who listened to those radio stations, then I knew that that comes with a whole pile of cultural and political sort of attitudes and behaviours and shared background. And so the key question really, when I was online dating was, what radio station do you listen to? And if they listened to commercial radio stations, then I just wasn't interested. But if they listened to the independent radio stations, then we had sort of a shared basis to go forward to. So I think that's the thing around recruiting, is if you can find some of those key criteria, like gateway criteria, then it sort of simplifies the process and you end up with really rich, diverse groups. Okay, let me talk around the first project. So we've done a lot of work for Melbourne City Council. So that's the main city council, I suppose, in the sort of the CBD of Melbourne. And we've done yearly usability testing to benchmark their website. So they've got an active website, or a number of websites, but we've been benchmarking the main website, which has a strong focus on providing key services to businesses, residents and businesses. And so each year we'd test the site and report back the issues, and they could get a sense of how they're improving or not improving against those key criteria. And we'd have diverse people. And we'd have to recruit residents, visitors to the city, small business people, across language type, age, gender, time in the city, time that they've been in Melbourne versus time. So quite complex recruiting criteria. And when we started off this, we tried a couple of different recruiting methods, and one was, we got a couple of people for a couple of years who were well networked within the city and tried to get them to recruit for us, because they boasted a lot of, their community connections and that sort of stuff. But that was just ended up being incredibly hard work for us. So then we found a boutique recruiting agency who we worked with. And I'm not, my experiences with recruiting agencies is when you start off with them, it can be a little bit of a bumpy ride, and it's very hard to do it by remote control. It takes a lot of dialogue with your recruiters in order to help clarify, because you set up some profiles, some segmentation. They start working on the screener questions for your recruiting. But they always have lots of questions about really, what do you mean by this, or what do you mean by that? And once they start recruiting, often they're giving feedback about, we've got someone like this or someone like that. So I see it as really, it's a collaborative approach with your recruiters to try and get the best possible candidates you can. So we're doing this testing each year, about 15 people. And then one year we got the great opportunity to include an extra 4 or 5 people who had disabilities. In particular, we're focusing on people with visual impairment who used assistive technologies, because the council had done a lot of work to try and make the website accessible. So they had accessibility audits and they'd done a bunch of technical stuff. So they thought things were pretty good, but they'd never actually tested the website with real people using assistive technologies, real people who had the disabilities that they were trying to do. So that was great. So we got the opportunity to include 4 or 5 people in the round of testing. Unfortunately, the recruiters were just hopeless. They just couldn't seem to work out any way to reach these people. So we really had to use our own contacts. We used contacts within council, friends of friends. And so look, finally it worked out. It was just much harder work that we'd anticipated. So we ended up with participants who had a great range of different visual impairments and used different devices. So some just used their phone and relied on Apple iOS as a screen reader. Some used JAWS on specially set up laptops. Some used magnifiers on the iPad. So look, it was a great variety. And the testing was fantastic. And I think the thing around when you're recruiting people with disabilities is, I mean, it's obvious you just need to take, we just need to take extra care in the arrangements for them about making sure they could find the place, making sure, we met them, we were available to come down to meet them, to guide them to the interview room, all that sort of stuff. So just a bit of extra care. The funny thing was, we're doing the interviews in the council office and we had to catch the lift upstairs. And you might have noticed the lifts, when you're in a lift, they often have a braille version of the floor on the buttons. So anyway, one of our participants in there, and we're going up to the first floor, and so she's reading the buttons, and of course she finds out that there's mistakes in them. So it was pretty funny, because it's an example of you've got a technology like a lift, you're putting in support to help people with vision impairments, but who actually ever tests it to see that if it's actually saying the right thing? Anyway, we did the testing, and look, it was fantastic. It really showed that the technical testing they'd done was pretty inadequate, because there were some fundamental blockers to those people using assistive technology to do it. So there were technical blockers. But the other really big thing that came out, which I've seen in other usability sessions, is that the content design was really poor if you're vision impaired. Because when you're vision impaired, and you can see through the sessions, people's focus of attention, either with a screen reader or through a magnifier, it's very small. They can't scan the whole page, sort of obvious. But so what you need is, you need a content design that is very gently layered. So you go from the big picture to some more detail, so some more details, to some more detail. So you need a content design that really leads people through a path, so they're very sure about where they are. Whereas the content design on the council website was very much based on someone's ability to quickly scan the page and find the bit relevant to them. The other thing that really came through is the council's homepage for their website was set up as one of those what's new sort of things. Lots of different boxes trying to feature this or this or this or that. And it was very clear that, several of the participants, the way they used websites was to rely on home as a way of introducing the content for the website. Now, that used to be a very solid sort of concept back in the 90s, early 2000s. The home pages would always introduce in a methodical way what content the website had. But that's changed a lot, and it's changed for the bad, for the worse, really. So for these vision impaired people, they could never really get a sense of an overview of the content structure of the website, except through the menus, and that was sort of problematic. So anyway, look, it was very interesting. And the great thing is that we recorded all those sessions, and mainly we used like a document camera, so we could sort of get the view of what was going on. And then those videos went back to the dev team and the content design team, so they could really get a sense of, well, what's the challenges for people with vision impairment, and what does that mean for our design? The next thing I want to talk to you is, I'll probably only just get through this one because we might run out of time. Anyway, is a job we did for the Mental Health Tribunal. So the Mental Health Tribunal so it's set up in Victoria, maybe where you live as well, this is sort of the case. If you're have a serious mental issue, serious mental illness, your doctor can certify you to say that you must have mandatory treatment, and that might be you may be placed in a hospital, in a locked ward, or you may be forced to have mandatory medical, medical like drug treatment. And so you can be ordered to do that. So that's enforced. That order lasts for 28 days. And within those 28 days, the patient will have a mental health tribunal hearing. And that's a panel of people who are independent of the patient and of the doctors, and who listen to the cases about what's going on and to decide whether the order should be continued for more than 28 days. And for the tribunal, their key was, how can we increase participation rates from patients? Because they knew, so typically a lot of patients wouldn't attend to the tribunal. So you just have their psychiatrists or doctors there, and the patients would be absent. So they really wanted to increase patients' attendance, because they knew that if patients attended, typically the outcomes for the patient were better. So they were redesigning their website and got us involved to help solve this problem through the website. The great thing is the client was very, focused on it through all aspects of the project, including people with lived experience. So our recruiting brief was to find people who had suffered serious mental illness and appeared at the mental health tribunal, or people who have suffered serious mental health illness and had the potential to appear at the tribunal. So to talk to those people and or their care, with their carers, to talk about their experience. So this isn't a segment that you can pull off a recruiting database or cold call on. So very tricky. So we decided it was too tricky to use a recruiter. So we worked with community support groups and direct referrals from key stakeholders to try and find the right people, which we did. I mean, the hiccups were working with community support groups, because again, they're not recruiting agencies, so they work in their own sort of inimitable way. So it required a lot of hand-holding. Things were a bit slow, but we got there. And so we end up doing a great range of people. We end up doing interviews either with people by themselves or in pairs, with their carer or family member. And we devised an interview guide which tried to give plenty of leeway, so that the interview, the participant didn't feel pressured. So less interview and more invitation to chat. And you can imagine that the interviews were really rich and moving, because people talked about their perceptions about, because you have to remember what happens, you're in the midst of a mental health crisis, and then you get a letter from the tribunal asking you saying there's going to be a tribunal hearing about your situation and inviting you to attend. And people talked about their feelings about when they get this letter, how they feel like it's like getting a parking fine, or they've done something wrong and they're getting punished because of the name tribunal and all those sorts of things. And they didn't feel like it encouraged them to participate. So look, the interviews were fantastic. From our point of view, we felt very privileged to be able to chat to these people and just find out more about their sort of situation. And so it led us to design a very simple and pared back website that wouldn't overwhelm people, but encourage them to be involved. And really, we thought the scenario which kept on coming to us is that someone has just got a letter from the tribunal and they're in hospital and they've accessed a shared machine or a mobile phone from a relative, and they're trying to find out information about what's going to happen. And they're in, and they're in the midst of crisis at that time. So what can we pull back? How can we make it simpler and more direct to go through? So yeah, it was a very interesting experience. The final project I'll just briefly touch on was a bit different in that we had a major research project about people's experience in renting property in Victoria, because there are going to be major changes to the way the laws governing tenancy. And so the client was the state government, and they wanted to find more about people's experience, but particularly those people who rent in boarding houses and caravan parks. So this is a hard segment to get to. And certainly in Melbourne, boarding houses are a place of transitional housing and situations where people come out of drug rehabilitation, they go into a boarding house. They come out of jail, they go into a boarding house. Very, very, like volatile sort of situations. And in caravan parks, people are quite transient. So they might stay in the park a couple of months and move on. And they're very much subject to the whim of the caravan park manager. So in that case, what we did is we did very broad scale recruiting. So we're working with a marketing agency. So we were producing leaflets and flyers, and we'd letter drop boarding houses and caravan parks in order to get participants. And we had to get quite a few. We ended up having to get 60 for interviews and 1,300 for survey. But it was a great experience. Out of the research, really, we were able to produce really detailed findings about the pain points that people experience when they're renting and how different types of people negotiate those pain points, either successfully or not successfully. And a lot of our participants were in poverty or close to it and having a hard time. So for us, it was a great privilege to be able to bring their voice back to government. And, you feel you're the conduit for getting their voice towards the decision makers. So look, it was really a profound experience. I mean, in all of this, we have to look after the interviewers, because in that interview process, those interview processes aren't traumatic, but people are telling you about the things that they've gone through. So it's just about taking care, allowing the interviewers to debrief. So just in summary, I mean, if you're involved in user research or design, you know that the research element's critical, and to that, recruitment's critical. It's a critical milestone. And I get really nervous before we recruit, and I get really nervous while we're recruiting. And then I'm only relieved once we've successfully, done the research, because everything counts on getting good participants. And the more diverse your participants are, in my case, the more I learn. And it also makes my job much more interesting. And it's that finding those participants, it's where recruitment, it's that art in that it requires diligence and patience, and it requires a bit of inspiration as well. And once you can work through that, then you get the great rewards of sitting down and talking to interesting people and finding out what they think. So that's it from me, Barbara. If there are any questions or anything?
A bit of a silent clap. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Right, my pleasure.
Through that, really interesting, and to hear the various and different approaches for each of the situation and the projects that you have worked on. It was very inspiring, and I also wrote down some questions, but let's go to the chat first. I see that Inyo asked a question in the chat. Inyo, maybe do you want to unmute and just share it directly?
Yeah, sure. Just here during your pitch that you mentioned the best candidate, and I wanted to know, like, what makes a candidate the best candidate? Like, is it the soft skills? Are those the hard skills? Like, what makes someone special?
I know, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because this comes down to segmentation, about like how do you try and define the segments of who you really want to talk to? And you can really you can make it too hard for yourself. For me, the best candidate is, you think about them as a pool. So I've just completed a round where we've had 8 candidates. So you think about, okay, what's happening across this group? The best candidates for me are people who have already or are likely to have an interest or a stake in what you're researching on. Yeah, because you don't want to get people who are, and occasionally this has happened, you get people who are very uninterested and they go, oh yeah, whatever. So you don't, you can feel that they don't feel tied. So if you can have a candidate who has some emotional or, intellectual commitment to your project, they might not know it until you introduce it, but then it triggers them. So that's really critical. And then the other great thing is, of course, you need a candidate who can talk and who can express themselves in a way, but in a variety of ways. So sometimes you get the really talky ones or the less talky ones, but it's just that engagement process. And then when I think about the group of 8, it's really, have we touched on a mix of ages? Because we know things are different when people are older versus when they're younger. Or have we touched on, a mix of gender or socioeconomics? I think really important. You don't want to keep, I try and avoid skewing to middle class people all the time. And how do we find people, working class people, different people, and also language backgrounds really important to me. If we can get diverse language backgrounds in our recruiting, that's sort of a gateway criteria, I think, to helping make things a lot richer.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I was going to ask, I hope it answered your question. Thanks so much. So in the meantime, if there are more questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I also have a question that I will quickly ask you, Jonathan. So you mentioned indeed the second project that you talked about the mental health tribunal. But it's I can imagine, a very sensitive and emotional also conversation that you sometimes have with people, and a lot of experiences and subjective sort of input that you're dealing with. How do you base the decisions for implementation? Where do you base those decisions upon eventually? How is it difficult to sort of go through all the output basically that has been generated and all the insights that you have, and to finally choose then what is worthwhile on taking further?
Yeah, good point. I think it's the same for any project, in that the sort of qualitative research we do, I don't know why, but typically the big issues are very big. And they come out, and you run the research and you come out with 3 or 4 really big issues that really matter to the design. And then there's a whole pile of myriad of little small things. So we just try and focus on the big issues. Let's try and get those bits right, and then deal with everything else. So yeah, it's that interesting thing around, and you might, the qualitative research, in the end, you don't need to be speaking to that many people till you see the same big issues appear over and over again. And so, typically, our interviews, we do somewhere between 6 to 15 when we're doing usability testing. And you start hearing the same message. So
yeah, that makes sense. It also shows in the process potentially indeed already immediately the areas that you need to dig deeper into and to find out more about, I can imagine.
And I think also, Barbara, it relates to developing clear success criteria. So I'm always really extremely task focused in trying to design, websites and in the testing, because there's a lot of noise going around. But the fundamental question is, can someone arrive at your service, complete a task, and feel confident and positive about that task? Exactly. There's a lot of other stuff going on for people, but if you get round to that task sort of focus, then it really sort of narrows your attention. And for us, it was great. It was all around, how do we increase the number of people who attend tribunal hearings? So we had a very clear metric to think around, which makes life much easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing and for your time. Thanks also everyone for joining in today. I'm super aware that we're a couple of minutes over, so I'm going to launch this quick poll just because we always want to check in how you've experienced it and how you found today's session. Big thanks to Jonathan for sharing your stories and your experience with us. A lot of learnings today. And I wish everyone an amazing rest of your Thursdays. Hope to see you next week, where we're welcoming Anna Borbotko from TomTom. And all the best. Have a great Thursday.
Thanks, everyone.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.